The Black Hawk kicked up a blinding cloud of dust as we descended toward Outpost Serpent. Through the haze, I glimpsed what would be home for the next 6 months. Fortified buildings perched on a mountain plateau surrounded by nothing but jagged peaks and silent valleys. The receiving party struck me as odd. The soldiers stood rigid, eyes scanning not just for threats, but watching the shadows with unusual intensity. 11 years in the army had taught me to read a unit's mood, and something here felt off.
Staff Sergeant Walsh, a weathered officer, approached. "Lieutenant Colonel Patterson, welcome to Outpost Serpent. Get your gear and meet me at command in 30 minutes.
Command center was bare bones, military efficiency stripped down by isolation. Patterson closed the door, his manner shifting from formal to urgent. "What I'm about to tell you won't be found in any field manual," he said quietly. "We call them local protocols, non-negotiable out here." He listed 5 bizarre rules. 1. Don't look at moving shadows during noon prayers. 2. Stay indoors during calls to prayer from the destroyed mosque. 3. Quarantine soldiers with unexplained sand in their boots. 4. Plug your ears when wedding music comes from underground during sandstorms. And 5. Restrain anyone speaking ancient Aramaic in their sleep. I kept my face professional while wondering if isolation had cooked up these superstitions. "With respect, sir." "I don't care what you think, Staff Sergeant. Follow them or people die." That night, panicked voices drew me to the barracks. Private Rodriguez lay rigid in his bunk, eyes open but unseeing, speaking in fluid, guttural tones. "It's Aramaic," whispered Specialist Frank, as others quickly restrained Rodriguez. "He's receiving instructions." The fear in their eyes wasn't fake. These combat veterans, men who'd faced firefights without flinching, were terrified of their sleeping comrades' words. I told myself there had to be a rational explanation. But as Rodriguez's foreign words filled the darkness, something deep and primal in my brain recognized a truth my educated mind refused to accept. We weren't alone on this mountain. I couldn't sleep after Rodriguez's episode. By morning, I'd convinced myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe he'd picked up phrases from previous deployments. The veteran's fear was just the result of isolation and stress. 3 days later, I led my first patrol near the ancient village ruins. A standard security sweep with Specialist Jackson, Private First Class Martinez, and Corporal Frank, all veterans of Outpost Serpent. "Remember, Sergeant," Frank said as we geared up, "stick to the established paths. The locals consider the ruins sacred ground." I nodded, appreciating his cultural awareness while privately thinking these precautions were more about avoiding hidden bombs than supernatural consequences. The patrol was routine until Jackson spotted movement near a cave entrance. "Permission to check it out?" he asked. "Granted. 2 minutes, no more." Jackson slipped into the small cave opening. He came back out quickly. "Nothing there, Sergeant, just shadows." Back at base, as we took off our gear, I noticed Jackson's boots were covered in fine, pale sand. We hadn't crossed any sandy areas. The whole patrol route was rocky ground. "Jackson, where'd you pick up that sand?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He looked down, genuinely puzzled. I don't know, Sergeant. I don't recall walking through sand." Patterson's 3rd rule echoed in my head. Any patrol member who returns with sand in their boots but no memory of walking through sand is compromised. put them in quarantine immediately. I decided against reporting it. No sense spreading superstitious panic. That night, scratching sounds woke me. Jackson sat straight up in his bunk, drawing strange, sharp-cornered symbols in his notebook while whispering something under his breath. "Jackson, everything okay?" He didn't respond until I grabbed his shoulder. He snapped back to alertness, confused. "Sergeant Walsh, is it time for watch?" "No, you were..." I pointed to the notebook. He looked down, clearly shocked. "I didn't draw these."
Suddenly, a violent blast of wind hit the barracks, and fine sand began trickling through every crack and seam. A full-blown sandstorm swept down on us within minutes. Then I heard it, music rising from beneath the floor. Wedding music getting louder, sounding festive and strangely inviting. Several soldiers immediately clapped their hands over their ears. "Plug your ears, Sergeant," Frank yelled over the storm. "Remember the fourth rule." Curiosity overruled my caution. Instead of covering my ears, I moved closer toward the sound. The music grew more hypnotic. My surroundings shifted. I stood in the middle of a wedding celebration within the ancient village, impossibly restored to wholeness. People danced joyfully in clothes from centuries past. A bride moved toward me, smiling, holding out her hand. As I reached to take it, her skin instantly began to decay. The dancers rotted away into corpses, their happy movements twisting into grotesque jerks. The wedding music warped into a deep, slow funeral mourning song. The ground split open, revealing a pit packed tight with stacked bodies. The decaying dancers tumbled into the mass grave, limbs still twitching. The bride's putrid hand clamped onto mine, pulling me toward the pit. A sharp slap snapped me back. Frank stood there, forcibly pressing my hands over my own ears while holding his own ears plugged tighter. "Don't listen," he shouted, his voice strained. "It's not meant for us." The storm eventually died down. In the morning, Jackson was gone. His bunk was empty. On the wall beside it, scratched deep into the plaster, were the same jagged symbols from his notebook. No one reported him missing. No one said his name. Later, I found a new name added to a small, unofficial memorial wall tucked away in a corner. Specialist Thomas Jackson, with yesterday's date. I'd broken one of Patterson's rules, and a man under my command was gone. I could no longer brush off these local protocols as just wild stories and superstition. Something was deeply wrong at Outpost Serpent, and my logical mind was running out of ways to explain it away. The day after Jackson's disappearance felt surreal. I organized a search party at first light, but the colonel's face told me all I needed to know. We weren't looking for a man, but confirming a casualty. "Staff Sergeant Walsh," Patterson said, his voice low as we assembled. "Keep it contained. No communications outside the base about this. As far as command is concerned, Jackson is on medical leave until we sort this out." We found nothing of Jackson except his dog tags, half buried in pale sand near the cave entrance, and strange markings carved into stone, the same symbols he'd been drawing before he vanished. I pocketed the tags, feeling their weight like an accusation. Each failure to follow the rules was costing lives, and I had dismissed them as stress-induced fantasy. Back at the base, I examined Jackson's bunk. Someone had stripped his bedding but hadn't noticed or chose to ignore the etchings on the wall behind his pillow.
crude, desperate carvings of the same symbols, as if he'd spent hours frantically working them into the concrete with whatever tool he could find. That afternoon, I went with a patrol to the village. As the local imam called the faithful to noon prayers, I noticed something odd about the shadows cast by the villagers. They seemed to shift, not with the movement of their owners, but independently, like they were restless. I remembered Patterson's first rule but couldn't look away. One shadow stretched toward me, its fingers growing impossibly long before snapping back as its owner moved. "Don't stare," Frank whispered harshly, yanking my arm. "For God's sake, Walsh, don't you remember the first rule?" I tore my gaze away, but it was too late. That night, the nightmares began. I dreamed of being buried alive, sand filling my lungs as ancient voices chanted above me. I woke gasping, positive I'd seen a figure standing in the corner of my quarters. When I flicked on my light, nothing was there, but the shadow cast by my footlocker seemed darker than it should be, almost solid. The next day, orders came through. We were to investigate caves where ancient artifacts had been discovered. The long-serving men exchanged knowing looks. "Sir," Sergeant Frank approached me privately, "these caves, they're directly beneath where Jackson disappeared." I nodded, keeping my expression professional despite the cold dread spreading through me. "Standard procedure, Frank. We follow orders." That night, I found myself researching local history on the base's limited network. What I discovered chilled me. Archaeological surveys from the 1980s mentioned a pre-Islamic burial site in these mountains, with descriptions of protective symbols identical to what Jackson had drawn. The report had been suddenly stopped, classified by military intelligence with no explanation. As I shut down my computer, I thought I caught movement in the corner of my eye, a human silhouette that vanished when I turned. I wasn't alone in the room, yet no one was there. The shadows in the corners seemed to pulse, watching me with patient malice. Patterson's rules weren't superstition. They were warnings written in blood, and I was beginning to understand the price of ignoring them. The helicopter returned 3 days early, its rotors slicing through the morning stillness. At the landing zone, only 4 of the 6-man cave exploration team emerged. Sergeant Willis stumbled out, pale and confused. When he collapsed, I saw distinctive pale sand spilling from his boot, identical to what I'd seen with Jackson before he vanished. "Sir Willis needs immediate quarantine," I told Captain Rivera, Patterson's third rule pounding in my skull. "Anyone returning with unexplained sand is compromised." "That's not your call, Sergeant Walsh," Rivera snapped back. "Willis needs a doctor, not isolation." The older soldiers exchanged knowing looks as Willis was helped toward the infirmary. I followed close behind. He wouldn't leave my sight. The shadows in the corners seemed to throb, almost eager. In the medical bay, Willis spoke in broken pieces. "Something's inside the base now," he said with a creepy calm. "We found it in the caves. Or maybe it found us. Mendez saw it first. He reached for it. Then Taylor tried to help him and—" His words faded, replaced by a vacant grin spreading over his face. That's when it happened. The impossible sound. The call to prayer echoed from the direction of the bombed-out mosque, seeming both far away and unnervingly close at the same time. "Nobody leaves this building," I ordered, physically blocking the doorway as Rivera started to argue. Patterson's second rule was crystal clear. When that call sounds, everyone stays indoors. Willis began to laugh, a dry, snapping sound. They're coming up, coming through. We broke the seals in the cave, the old binding marks. His eyes suddenly turned solid, empty black, reflecting nothing. Not Willis anymore, he said, his voice seeming to rumble up from deep underground. Willis is part of us now. He moved faster than any human should, grabbing Dr. Levin and then lunging at me. I fired twice, dead center, but the bullets barely slowed him down. Only Sergeant Frank jamming a sedative needle into him saved me from being crushed. After Willis was secured and the unnatural call to prayer finally stopped, Lieutenant Colonel Patterson arrived carrying a heavily classified file stamped with the highest security level. Outpost Serpent wasn't built here by accident, Patterson said tiredly, spreading faded photos across the table, excavations from 1982 where a Soviet expedition vanished. This area was home to a pre-Islamic cult. They practiced human sacrifice to keep ancient things buried deep under the earth. The photos showed burial chambers. Their walls were carved with the exact same symbols Jackson had scratched everywhere before he disappeared. The protocols aren't old wives' tales, Patterson continued grimly. They were built after we studied what happened to the Soviets. We thought we'd locked it down, until someone started breaking the rules. The lights throughout the command center flickered wildly. In that instant of darkness, multiple shadows slid independently across the walls, shapes like people but all wrong, stretched and twisted. They're not just in the caves anymore, Patterson whispered, his own shadow looming large. They're inside the base now, and they're hungry. The shadows slithered across the walls like living ink. I stumbled back as one long, thin tendril reached toward me, its movement stiff and unnatural. "Everyone out," I ordered, bypassing the chain of command. To my surprise, Patterson didn't countermand me. Instead, he snatched a metal case from beneath his desk and hurried out right behind us. A sandstorm slammed into the base with impossible speed, swallowing the entire compound. Communications died instantly. The wind screamed, but with voices now, hundreds of them sounding like children and adults crying out in forgotten languages. Panic spread everywhere. Soldiers started ignoring rules and procedures left and right. "Gather in the chapel," Patterson commanded, voice cutting through the din. "The protocols will hold. They'll protect us." I hung back. Through a side window of the small building acting as our worship space, I watched Patterson lead most of the remaining personnel inside. He unpacked items from his case onto a makeshift altar, clay tablets, beaten copper bowls, and something carefully wrapped in old, faded cloth. My stomach dropped. It wasn't a protective ritual. It was all wrong. This was set up for sacrifice. Frank appeared beside me, breathless. "The missing men," he whispered, eyes wide. "I found some records, Sarge. Every 6 months, without fail, exactly 5 soldiers disappear. Always right after someone breaks one of the key protocols." The brutal pattern clicked into place. The rules weren't for our protection after all. They were a selection process. Each violation marked a soldier as suitable for feeding. We weren't keeping the entities contained. We were feeding them, trapping their meals. Patterson began chanting, the harsh guttural sounds of ancient Aramaic, just like I'd heard from Rodriguez. The shadows around him grew thicker, darker, starting to solidify into tangible shapes. I couldn't let this happen. I threw myself through the window glass. My only goal was the central artifact. A small black obsidian figurine where Patterson had stacked the dog tags ripped from the missing men. I grabbed it and smashed it down hard against the stone floor. "No!" Patterson shrieked as the figurine shattered. The shadows shrieked too, a deafening chorus. Suddenly visible to everyone in the chapel, fully revealed, they descended on Patterson first. He vanished inside a mass of writhing darkness. "Follow me," I shouted at the stunned survivors who could still move. I led them through the chaos, out of the building and into the storm, veering through specific blind spots I knew existed along the perimeter, spots where the entities seemed unable or unwilling to cross. "That's desertion, Sergeant!" Captain Rivera yelled over the howling wind. "No, sir, it's survival," I shot back. I knew my military career was burning to ash, but keeping these people alive meant more than any promotion or pension ever could. 6 months ago, I'd have followed orders without blinking. Now I knew the monstrous truth. 3 days later, our ragged group stumbled into Forward Operating Base Hawkeye. I should have felt overwhelming relief. Instead, cold dread coiled in my gut as Captain Lewis welcomed us, pulling me aside almost immediately to brief me on their newly established local protocols. The entities hadn't been stopped. They were spreading.